All right. Let's get this started. Of course, in true Zoom style, my cat is about to jump on me. But my name is Greg Hanscom. I am the executive director and publisher of High Country News, and really happy to be with you today. So happy that so many people could join us for our conversation this morning about the public lands and increased use of the public lands and what communities and land management agencies are doing about it. Once again, for folks who've just tuned in, you can see us, but we cannot see you or hear you at this point. So you should see myself and our two panelists, who I'll introduce in a minute. We can't see or hear you. If you have questions for us or comments over the course of the next hour, please go ahead and plug them into the chat, and we will see them there, and we'll make some time to address audience questions later in the hour. We may sprinkle a few into the conversation here as we go. So I am, again, Greg Hanscom. I'm the executive director and publisher. I'm going to be your host today. And this event, as I say, is really all about getting to know some of the people behind the scenes at High Country News and talking a little bit about our public lands. It's an event for donors of High Country News. And there are a lot of you. Every year, more than 10,000 High Country News subscribers make a donation to this organization on top of the subscription dues that you pay each year to get a copy of the magazine in your mailbox every month. So it is a remarkable community of people. We could not do our work without you. And this is the first of a series of conversations that we want to hold with and for you as supporters of this organization, as the people who power our work. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for joining us. And now my panelists. I want to introduce you all to Sarah Tory, who is joining us from beautiful Carbondale, Colorado. Sarah is a freelance writer. Her work has appeared in publications from Mother Jones to High Country News, of course, to The Atlantic and 5280. She's a longtime contributor to High Country News. And her most recent story, which appears in the October issue of the magazine, is specifically about people who are making a home of it, living on the public lands in a long-term fashion. So welcome, Sarah. It's great to have you. And then our other panelist for today is Jonathan Thompson. Jonathan, also a freelance writer and author and editor with deep roots in Colorado and deep roots at High Country News as well. He's a former High Country News editor. And you know Jonathan, no doubt, from his Facts and Figures column that he produces for the magazine each month. You may also know that he's got a great independent project going right now called The Land Desk. And it is in the form of an email newsletter that comes regularly to your inbox. And you can find that at landdesk.org. Is that right, Jonathan?
That's correct.
That's great. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
It is great to be here. I wanted to just start by asking you, Sarah, to tell us a little bit about the main character in your recent story for High Country News, Kanisha Fernandez. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got to know Kanisha?
Yeah, Kanisha and her husband, Stephen, and their 4 kids had moved to this dispersed camping area near where I live in Carbondale. I think it was in early June, and my partner was actually at a gas station in Carbondale and saw Kanisha had hitched/walked into town to figure out if they could get a tow truck for their van that had broken down. And so they were sort of stranded out on in this their campsite, and yeah, he offered to help them. So he actually gave her a ride back to town. She called the tow truck company. It was too far away and on a dirt road, so they don't tow out there. So they were sort of out of luck in that regard. So my partner drove her back, and he kind of saw their whole tent set up down there. Excuse me. And he came back, and I just happened to be telling him about the story I was working on. And he said, "Oh, I just helped this woman who's living down this area called Thompson Creek with her family. I think they're living there full time. You should go talk to them." And so I went down the next day. He left for a little while. And so I went down and kind of introduced myself and asked them about their decision to move onto public land and sort of the genesis of that. And yeah, we started talking. I explained the story I was working on, and they were super open to talking to me and letting me kind of come hang out with them pretty regularly over this summer. And it was a pretty wild summer here because the area where they were living, it's at the bottom of this dirt road that has a lot of clay in it. So it becomes pretty impassable once it rains, and we had a lot of rain. So I was always sort of timing my visits I was kind of, I'd be looking up in the sky wondering, oh my gosh, am I going to get stuck down there if I go down and visit? Okay, I'll just risk it. Or they would call asking for a ride because they were really trying to figure out how to get another vehicle because the one they had bought to leave Las Vegas had broken down, and it was just stuck down at this campsite. And so they were trying to figure out how to get a new vehicle so they could actually move, because you're not supposed to stay in a particular place for more than 14 days. So they were in sort of this tough situation. And I would, often drive them back to town after they'd been trying to fix their car or look for a new one. Stephen was working as a mover, and it was 8 miles up a hill to get back to where, and he was on this sort of janky bike at first. So we that's sort of how our relationship evolved. And over the course of the summer of just me going down there to hang out, also me driving them back to their campsite and kind of just trying to be a little bit of a support for them while they were sort of letting me into their life and story for my story.
Yeah. So, and tell us a little bit about how they came to be there. What was the inspiration? What were kind of the contributing factors that led Kanisha and her family to live in a tent on LM lands?
They are originally from San Diego and left San Diego probably 6 years ago because housing prices were just going up so much. They were really struggling to find a 2-bedroom, for less than $2,000. And they had a friend in Vegas who said it was much cheaper there. So they moved there, lived there for 5 years, but really just it never really felt like a good fit for them. Kanisha hated the heat. They just felt like they were working all the time to pay rent. Housing prices started going up there too. I think were just struggling to sort of provide the kind of life for their kids that they wanted. And ended up, Kanisha saw this YouTube video of a family camping full time and was really inspired to sort of give up this whole model that they'd sort of thought they had to follow to live, and go and try and emulate what that family they saw doing. And that led them to sell all their things. They're super spontaneous and risk takers for sure. Sell all their things, sell their car, get a new car that kind of could accommodate more things, a minivan, and just head out. And they just had this, Kanisha was served in the Army, so she had this pass that allowed them to access a lot of national parks and stuff for free. So they kind of took that as inspiration and were like, let's get out. They wanted to go somewhere green. They wanted to go to forests. So they sort of made their way to Utah first, and then to Colorado, just kind of looking at the map and thinking, oh, that looks like a nice spot. So that was the inspiration. I think, housing prices were definitely a push factor, and just the idea that you have to, pay so much money in rent. So much of your income just to live became increasingly intolerable for them.
Right. Got it. So kind of a combination of kind of a combination of just financial reality and this sort of romantic notion. I mean, I have to say, living in the woods sounds to me like a kid's dream. Like how, so they have four young kids out there. How did it go? Like how was it working at first?
I think it definitely presented some challenges that were not they didn't anticipate necessarily, or that weren't represented in this sort of idealized video on YouTube they saw. Yeah, I think on the one hand, it was so great for their kids to, be learning from the natural world and experiencing it and having all these experiences that they just felt were really out of reach for them in the city in Vegas. They just never had time to go into nature and onto public lands and kind of take their kids with them. It just felt too daunting. And so suddenly they were just living it. They were just doing it. And that part was really great. I think the whole schooling aspect, the not having a permanent address, the being stuck down at that campsite without a car, dealing with, the threat of rangers coming and telling them to leave and not really having a place to go, that added a lot of stress to the situation that they hadn't fully planned for. And that, not to mention, winter and cold temperatures, and all the rain also added some added stress. They thought, Colorado would be really dry, and it turned out to be a little different. So yeah, I think it was a mixture of, yes, this is so wonderful for our children, this is what we want, and also, wow, this is really hard, we haven't anticipated X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, got it. Well, so and Jonathan, you've written a lot about sort of the increased use on public lands. There is a piece of this, obviously, that is driven by really hard economic realities, people who are actually using public lands as places to live. There is also a massive piece of this that is about recreation and tourism. Talk to us about what you've seen out there, and maybe give us a sense for how big this is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two things feed into each other. I mean, I think that the uptick in recreation on public lands and that more people wanting to go to public lands for whatever reason, and to those towns near public lands, especially, is driving up housing prices in those places. So the Durangos, the Tellurides, the Teton counties of the world, places that were already kind of out of reach for a lot of people, have now become outrageously out of reach because people want to be, they're desirable, and they're desirable because they're surrounded by public lands. And so that creates high housing prices, which then creates this push for people they can't afford housing. And so they end up, as in the case of the story that Sarah told, end up living on public lands in many cases. But yeah, I mean, the push for like the recreational surge onto public lands, I think it started before COVID. Actually, I mean, I think you could really see it if you look like 2018, really starting maybe like around 2013, 2014, for reasons that I don't really know. But if you look at national park visitor statistics, you see this upturn starting. Certainly in Utah, a big part of it was because they start marketing them like crazy with the Mighty Five marketing campaign, which was focused on the 5 big national parks in Utah and southern Utah: Capitol Reef, Zion, Arches, etc. And that, I think that started in 2015 or 2013. It was global in scope. You would see, I once was in London and saw a taxi cab, one of those classic London taxi cabs with delicate arch on it, and Utah, like driving down the street, it was bizarre. And so that was a big part of it. It was just marketing for those Utah ones. But, by 2018, you were seeing visitation had increased at Zion and Arches it had doubled in the last 10 years, from like 1 million to 2 million or whatever. And then COVID hit, there was this huge dip, and then it just surged like crazy. And so the latter part of 2020 was insane. There was all these records set at all the national parks, really just about everywhere. There with a few exceptions. And then 2021 it's just continued to increase. Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks, they've set visitation records every month this year. And Yellowstone, I believe, has actually already set a record for the year, even though there's 3 months left.
That's amazing. So part of it is just outright marketing. A part of it, no doubt, is people who are completely desperate to get out of their homes where they've been stuck with COVID. How about social media? How about Instagram? Sarah mentioned YouTube videos that make, living on the public lands look pretty romantic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a huge factor, because if you look at where the places that get popular and the places that don't, especially if they're not national parks, it tends to be the places that are very Instagrammable, if you will. So, I mean, the classic example is Horseshoe Bend, which is just south of Glen Canyon Dam. It's on the Colorado River, and it's where the river does that big bend, and you can get up above and you take a picture of it. And the river there is really green, the Colorado River, and it goes around these burnished brownish orange cliffs. It's very beautiful and very attractive, and it's about, I don't know, half a mile away from the road. It was a place that 10, 15 years ago was not that well visited. You'd see pictures of it in
I was
tourist
gonna
brochures.
say, yeah, I remember it as being fairly deserted.
Yeah, because all it is an overlook. It's not like it's not like you can do anything there, right? Except take pictures. But once Instagram came around and that thing started popping up, now it gets, something like 1 million visitors a year. People just making this desert hike across half a mile to stand there and take a picture and walk away.
Yeah.
Take the same picture that so many people have taken. And another example is Ice Lake Basin, which is near Silverton, Colorado. It's a pretty good hike. It's a 7-mile hike straight up, high altitude. It's not easy, but it's spectacular because of the wildflowers and the greenish color of the lake. And it's great for Instagram. And it has, in the last few years, it went from the type of place you could go hike it in the middle of summer and you might see 1 or 2 other people, to, I think, Labor Day last year was 500 people a day.
Incredible.
Over the weekend. And that continued until there was a big fire. Actually, it's probably started by a hiker. And then this year it was actually closed because of the fire last year. So, I think social media is a huge factor as well as marketing.
Yeah. Just want to remind people and let folks know who have joined a little bit late that you are, in fact, joining High Country News in a conversation about the surge of use on our public lands. You can see us, we cannot see you or hear you. If you've got questions or comments, please drop them into the chat. We're gonna continue with this conversation for another 10 or 15 minutes, and then I will kind of look through some of the questions that you've submitted, and we'll toss those into the mix. So thanks everyone for being here. Sarah, I wanted to sort of turn it back to you and ask you if you would to paint a picture for us of Labor Day weekend 2020 on the Eastern Sierra.
How it was described to me, because I of course wasn't there, was kind of wall-to-wall campers and RVs and vans, I guess, on the public land outside of Mammoth Lakes. There's tons. The whole town is surrounded by public land, super accessible to the downtown, and just literally campers parked and camping wall to wall in this sort of apocalyptic smoke cloud from I guess it was it the creek? Yeah, it was the Creek Fire. Am I saying that right? I'm maybe blanking on the right name, but a really big fire that erupted 40 miles from Mammoth and really almost came within 10 miles of town. And so you have this sort of mix of just insane people, local residents freaking out about how many people were parked parked there and camping there who maybe didn't know the rules about fires and the risk that that posed. And then also this, very scary looking fire not very far away. And those two things, it was literally a tinderbox and exploded for many people who lived there, just their fears and worries about what could happen with all those visitors camping there. And, there were sort of vigilante patrols kind of going out. One local official I talked to was really worried about the threat of violence because, these people wanted to go and, talk to these campers who were making fires and kick them out. And just, she was worried about tension sort of boiling over. So from local residents and the conflict with these, all these visitors. So that was the scene that I was told.
How did so there was that kind of immediate moment of kind of panic around all the people out there in the forest and the fire. How did the town and the community respond after that season was over? Because they did take some steps, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a bunch of Eastern Sierra local officials kind of got together and sort of came up with a game plan that the result of which was this sort of app that you can download, and it tells you all the areas where you can and can't legally disperse camp, because a lot of the issue is some people just simply didn't know where you're allowed to disperse camp, and not because the boundaries and the signage are not very visible. Even I was driving around with Stacy Corliss, one of the local officials in Mammoth, and she said, as we were driving around, she could barely even tell where you were legally allowed to camp. So that was a huge issue that they resolved. And they just, better education around, okay, this is why you're not allowed to have fires, kind of just trying to educate people about best practices, and also putting up some more porta potties and I guess dumpsters. And there was also talk about creating safe camping areas, because a lot of the locals who were actually just living on public lands felt targeted by all the animosity towards this crush of visitors. And they felt all of them follow the rules. They know where it's legal to camp, where it's not legal. They don't, have wild campfires during a fire ban, et cetera. So they, local officials, started talking about, okay, what are the long-term solutions for that issue too? Because we don't want to conflate these two problems. Talk of a safe parking area. But it's been really hard to, lack of affordable housing for those folks is just the root cause of why you have people living on public land, and this crush of visitors is unrelated, but the two things got mixed in people's minds.
Yeah. Jonathan, kind of turning to you for some regional context here. But first, I do want to be sure to mention that Sarah's story was actually produced in partnership with Bay Nature magazine. So much of what High Country News does these days is collaborative or partnerships with other organizations, other publications. So just wanted to point that out. And Bay Nature's is fantastic pub. Jonathan, what are you seeing around the region in terms of communities and land management agencies dealing with this crush?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting because it varies a lot. But as far as land management agencies go, it seems like, well, there's the old way of dealing with the crush, which was to keep places secret, or to pretend like you kept places secret, right? You just like shut up and don't say anything about it, and hopefully people will go away. That's not an option anymore, because of the internet. There are no secret places anymore. So now you see kind of two competing approaches. One is to try to limit visitation to the popular places in one way or another. And sometimes that's a sort of de facto way, like Arches National Park, for example. They close the gate at some point. Once there's a certain amount of people in there, they just close the gate and say, sorry, you're gonna have to wait, or you have to go away. The other way is to make a more organized approach and have timed reservations, permits, that sort of thing. that approach, it kind of implies that those people, it's not like those people that don't get into the park are going to go away and go back home. They're going to go probably to another park, right? A less visited park. They're going to go, so the Arches people are going to go to Canyonlands, which has been a lot less popular, or the people who are trying to go to House of Fire in what's now Bears Ears National Monument again, they'll go to some other place in Bears Ears. And so that approach, a lot of people don't really want that, because there are these other places that are lesser known and they're not being impacted. And so why would you send people there? So their approach, they're saying, and I kind of agree with this, is like, let the people go to Arches, let the people go to Zion, staff up those places, build up the infrastructure as much as you need to handle these 5 million people a year, if that's what it's going to be, and keep those other places a little bit less well known, and maybe they won't go there. But
yeah, so it's
hard to say what's going to happen.
I once talked to a Park Service employee who told me that the National Park Service is a land management agency. Yeah, but more than that, it's a people management agency. And there are very few outfits in the world that manage people as well as the National Park Service does sometimes, in terms of handling crowds in very restricted places.
Yeah, and I think I think it's an interesting approach, because I think one of the things that the National Park Service tries to do, or that they see as their mission, is to make it an enjoyable experience for the people who visit, right? Obviously their first mission is to protect the area and to preserve it, but it's also important to them, I think, that they make it an enjoyable experience. And when you have whatever 5 million people divided by 365 per day, you have that many people per day visiting a place like Zion, it's going to be hard to keep it enjoyable. So there's going to be an impulse to tell those crowds to go somewhere else that's less crowded. And whether that's the right thing to do or not, I don't know. But I think that from a preservation standpoint, it might be better, just to try to handle those 5 million people as best as you can, whether that's shuttles, closing off certain areas, hardening is one of the terms they use. And so that would apply more to places that are in the backcountry now, but are popular. And that's where you put in toilets, you put in parking lots, you put in gravel trails so that people aren't making social trails. You put in lots of signs, fences, that sort of thing. There's a lot of debate going on the land management side. As far as the communities go, you see a lot of innovative types of things where communities are sending out public lands ambassadors, people who hang out at the trailhead, and volunteers who just tell people, like, this is how you're supposed to act when you're out here. Don't poop in the tundra, don't litter, stay on the trail, et cetera, et cetera. So so you've got that too.
Yeah. So I want to jump into some questions from readers, because we've got some actually that follow pretty nicely from this. Just a reminder to everyone that you have joined High Country News in a conversation about public lands. We're up to 152 people in the Zoom room right now. You can see us, we can't see you. So if you have questions, put them in the chat, and I'll try to work some of those questions from audience members into the conversation. So here's this question comes from Shelby Robinson, and it's related to what you were just talking about, Jonathan. What are your thoughts on new trail construction? We have a lot of that in Southwest Colorado. I know that I live in Seattle, and we've got a lot of that here as well. And it's specifically, some of it at least, is specifically designed to give people alternatives to the incredibly popular hikes and mountain bike rides that are near the city. I don't know, does it even work? Honestly, I find that those new trails are pretty deserted. Any thoughts from either of you?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't, in Southwestern Colorado, I think that it actually does work in my experience. Around Durango, there's an organization, Trails 2000, which is a volunteer nonprofit, and super proactive as far as, and they build a lot of trails. And they seem to get used. Whether that really disperses use off of the most popular trails or not, I don't know. It's hard to say, or whether that just increases, whether it's like building new highways where it just, it's induced demand and you get more people on more trails. That's hard to say. I think another issue, certainly in southwestern Colorado, is whether these trails are, whether all the trails need to be open to everybody or not, or whether some can be made off limits to mountain bikes, because you do have certainly some conflict between the mountain bikers and the walkers, and horseback riders and that sort of thing, because basically all the trails there are open to everybody, as opposed to like around Boulder, where most of the trails are not open to mountain bikes.
Yeah. Sarah, I'm curious what you found specifically in your research about dispersed camping and kind of how agencies have tackled that. We've got a question from Jim Rosenau. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, Jim. He says, I'm a regular dispersed camper and see wildly differing levels of enforcement from district to district. And he wonders if the Forest Service has considered an annual permit for dispersed camping. What did you find in your research for your story, Sarah?
Yeah, that was definitely an issue that came up, and actually one of the ways that Mammoth, the Eastern Sierra Coalition of local officials was looking to deal with the issue around the increase in dispersed camping was a more consistent enforcement policy. And there was talk of creating a permit, you have to pay to disperse camp to deal with some of the crush of visitors. But then also local officials, that Stacy, who I talked to a lot, was sort of grappling with this issue of, you don't want to make those who are actually living on public lands feel pushed out or unwelcome. So how do you sort of how do you make them part of these talks? And also, how do you deal with them and deal with, these non-recreational, these recreational visitors who are coming. And so just how, the tension between addressing one population's needs with the other, who are both using these lands, was very hard. And it was, so yeah, something that she's still grappling with for sure, and that locals are still grappling, but definitely, yeah, permits have become more common. I think in a lot of areas, they've almost shut down dispersed camping. I think outside of Crested Butte, and created, you have to reserve a campsite essentially, and there's more fees. Areas have been shut down altogether if overuse has become such a big problem that they can't, clean up the area properly. So there's been a range of responses, and definitely permits to disperse camp has become, in certain areas that have a lot of use, has become one of the solutions or one of the responses.
Yeah. I remember reporting on some of these questions in the early aughts. And this was kind of right around the time when user fees were really ramping up among public lands agencies. And there was a great hue and cry among a lot of public lands advocates and longtime recreationists who really felt that using the public lands was something of a birthright. And like me, we're used to being able to just drive out a Forest Service road or a BLM road and, throw your tent down in a flat spot. And, these are our lands, these are public lands. And also real concern, as you say, Sarah, about fees cutting people out. There are plenty of barriers already to many populations getting out and enjoying our public lands, and that just sort of adds another layer. Curious to know sort of if you ran into issues of that, just sort of access issues in your reporting. Did you run into people who felt like they were being priced out or chased out of the public lands unduly?
Yes, I think, one woman who, she wasn't in my story, but had kind of called out Stacy Corliss in Mammoth for basically it was a response to an op-ed that Chris Leonard wrote, basically in response to this sort of huge surge in dispersed camping the previous year, basically calling, and he had counted a bunch of RVs this past spring out on the public land around Mammoth, and kind of radically called for a ban on dispersed camping altogether. And that really incensed this woman who'd lived in her truck for decades around Mammoth, because she couldn't afford anything else. She was heavily in debt, and she had called up Stacy Corliss to basically express her frustrations with, like, hey, we're doing this legally, we're allowed to be here. If you make this impossible for us, like, where will we go? You haven't exactly served us. What have you done to help us? Where's the affordable housing? And Stacy said, you're right, actually, we haven't done enough to help bolster affordable local housing for workers. We just haven't done enough. So that definitely came up. And I think it also comes up with Stephen and Kenesha. They felt like public lands were inaccessible to them from living in Vegas. And it was only when they actually just went and lived there that they felt, and even then they felt almost like pushed off when, dealing with some of the rules around, oh, you can't be here anymore, even though of course the rules are there to protect the land. But they didn't see any other Black families out doing what they were doing. And it really raised some questions about who are public lands accessible for. And one researcher I spoke to actually brought this up, that, these lands have been managed for the public, are supposed to be managed for the public, but our concept of the public and our public has changed a lot since these rules were created. And often it was marketed and sort of sold to a very white, affluent audience around sort of recreation, driving your car to go camp with all your gear. And that use of public land, I think, is inaccessible to a lot of folks. It feels very inaccessible and non-inclusive to a lot of folks. So that was definitely a question that came up of how do we make these places accessible for everyone, while still acknowledging that the land has limits. And how do you balance these two needs, these competing needs sometimes?
Yeah, really important point. We've got a question from Donald Rodriguez, which really kind of follows right out of that. Donald says that as a researcher involved in determining the lack of interest in public lands in the early 1990s, I've been impressed by the number of outdoor interest groups around engaging minorities with the outdoors. Is there still a need to encourage engagement with the public lands among minority groups, or is this a moot point in a post-pandemic environment? Jonathan, you got any numbers on that, or any insights there?
I don't have any numbers on that, but I don't think it's a moot point. I think it's still, that's one of the tough things about this in general is, like, okay, it's good that people are visiting public lands, right? Because, it's healthy for people to be outside and to see these places. And it's potentially good for these places because you build this constituency that will then try to rally to protect these places. And so that's true with everybody. But I think definitely with people of color and other, low-income communities and people who have not been going to the public lands as big as numbers, I think there's definitely a need to continue to engage, for sure. Crowds are not, because they're everybody's public lands, right? They belong to everybody, and everybody should have equal access to them and be visiting them. So yeah, I do not think it's a moot point at all.
Yeah. I think there's a real reckoning right now within the conservation movement and environmental movement broadly, with the real lack of representation and inclusion in the movement's history. And I think this is all a part of it. High Country News has published some really interesting work around this, as have other outlets. So I think that's a really important point. I want to return to kind of this question of housing. This is a question from Joanna Cooper. I live in rural New Mexico, where we've seen a huge influx of people buying land and houses over the past year or so. She says it seems mainly from Texas and California. Shakes fist. No, she doesn't shake fist. It has really changed the flavor of our special little paradise, and I worry a lot about where this is going. You know, her question is, can you see an end to this migration? And do you think these folks will eventually move back to wherever they came from once winter hits? And I think this is a question that I've had too, is this really a very permanent shift now that we all can work from our living rooms or our cabins in the woods? Is this really a shift away from cities towards mountain towns? Maybe Sarah, you want to take that one? You live in a mountain town that's seen some influx in recent years.
Yeah, oof, that's a tough question. I don't see it subsiding anytime soon. But yeah, you're right. The mountain community I live in, which used to be sort of the affordable place that down valley, you know, it's 30 miles from Aspen. It was sort of like the more affordable place to live, close to the mountains, lots of artists, lots of workers, big immigrant community, and so many people are being, you know, pushed farther and farther down valley, farther away from their work in Aspen. And that's partially due to so many people moving here from cities who work remotely and whose jobs pay a lot more than what the local jobs offer. And it's created a huge worker shortage. You know, coffee shops and breweries and stuff can't find staff to work. Restaurants can't stay open. And I don't know if it's a long-term shift, but I think it's going to last long enough that we need to start thinking of some solutions to that issue. And I don't know what those solutions are exactly. Maybe some tax measures, building more affordable housing is definitely so much a part of it that I think a lot of mountain communities have just been slow to do and haven't done enough. That was definitely the case in Mammoth Lakes. They, you know, focus so much on getting more and more tourists. Like Jonathan mentioned, there was sort of the over tourism issue, marketing, selling these destinations. Suddenly with the pandemic, people can come work full time. You have Airbnb that took a lot of more affordable long-term rentals off the market. And so, I mean, towns just didn't stay on top of protecting existing affordable housing stock and building more to accommodate a local workforce. So they're now playing catch up, and it's going to be a while before they catch up, I think.
Yeah. Jonathan, thoughts on kind of whether this is a permanent shift and what communities can do?
Well, I mean, I think the desire to move to these places is going to continue. And like you say, even as the pandemic, assuming it ends, I think a lot of businesses are saying, you know what, we don't want to have offices because it costs too much. You can continue to work from your home. And so there will be that desire. I think that the place where it's going to hit a wall is when those communities that they're moving to, because of the unaffordability, start losing the kind of the characteristics that drew these people in the first place, and B, the amenities. Because, you know, I mean, I just went up to Telluride this summer, and some friends of mine and I, we were going to go out to eat, and I called them up and they said, where do you want to eat? And I said, hey, let's go to this taco joint I really like. And they said, no, closed, no staff. Okay, let's go to this pizza place. No, they only do takeout because they don't have enough staff. And, you know, so you've got, like, in Telluride, on the one hand, you know, the old timers will say, oh, it's lost its soul. And that's one thing. But on the other hand, it's losing some of the amenities. And that's one of the things, you know, people are drawn, of course, by the public lands and by the small town feel, but they're also drawn by the good restaurants and that kind of thing. And when it gets too expensive for people to work there and to live there, then it's going to be less desirable. So there is going to be a wall, I think. The problem with it is that when you hit that wall, I think the tourists will still want to go there. And so there will still be a demand for these short-term rentals. So people will continue to buy houses and the prices will continue to go up, but they'll just turn them into Airbnbs and go spend a couple of weeks there and then live somewhere else. And you'll still have all the same problems, but you'll have less of the community there. So I don't know that we're going to see like some big bubble popping as far as housing prices go, and all of a sudden we'll all be able to afford to live where we want to live. I don't see that happening.
Sarah, you had a rather pointed quote in your article about the impact of Airbnb on mountain towns. I won't repeat it, but what did you see out there? Because that's an element to this that we haven't really discussed much yet. What exactly has Airbnb done for, affordability in mountain towns?
Yeah, well, that was definitely a point brought up by Dirk Addis, somebody I spoke to who's been living in his van on public land in Mammoth and works in town for years. And he made the point that, a lot of Mammoth's formerly affordable housing, sort of more affordable housing stock, was these condos that people would have as sort of ski condos or investment properties, and they would rent them out to locals on a long-term basis. So that created a place for locals to live. But then Airbnb came along, and they realized, oh, you could, rent out these places for much less, just on Airbnb for nightly rentals, for way less time, and then get to use them maybe. And that took away a lot of the housing stock that locals used to rely on. And that's been happening in mountain communities all over the West. It's really been a problem. And so I think it's just exacerbated an already very strained housing market in a lot of places. And yeah, that story was repeated to me in a number of spots.
Quick question from Robin Kai. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Did you find more people that use public lands for dispersed living responsibly due to high cost of rents, as opposed to folks who are truly experiencing homelessness, the type you see in towns and cities? What were sort of the main roots causes that you saw, Sarah?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I wasn't focusing on urban homelessness issues. And I think public lands closer to urban areas, there's a lot more of that population of folks maybe suffering from drug or alcohol addiction, who really just can't access housing. And it's much more of circumstantial. It was much more of a choice, I think, precipitated by sort of bad choices, I suppose, or bad alternatives or high housing that I was focusing on in kind of more mountain communities, like Steve and Kenesha. It wasn't that they couldn't afford housing. They had been, in a traditional housing situation. Same with Dirk. He could technically afford something. It was just not an option that was appealing to them any longer. And so they just chose an alternative. So I think that distinction is really important to make, for sure. It's not necessarily that they can't afford housing. It's just that they don't want to pay so much to live, because prices are so high.
Got it. Oh man, you guys, we're getting all kinds of great questions. We are down to kind of our last about 5 minutes for this conversation. I did want to share just a couple of great comments / questions, because there's some really interesting stuff in here. Here is one from Chelsea Pennick. And Chelsea says, it seems apparent that we need flexible policy tools and responses that can accommodate people who bring their privilege to public lands, that is, folks who can go somewhere else, and those that lack privilege and would be disproportionately burdened by increased restrictions. Thoughts? I guess, Jonathan, I'll toss that one to you quickly. Thoughts on what a response like that could look like?
Oh yeah, that would be difficult, I think. It's one thing, like one of the challenges, I think, with trying to make restrictions or rules or whatever you call it about public lands, or especially where it's kind of selective like that, is that, you've got some of these public lands where, like a national park, where there's one gate and you go in or out that way and that's it. And you can do all kinds of things to control that. Most of the public lands aren't like that. There are huge places with not enough rangers, not enough enforcement, not enough funding to patrol them. And you just can't, like, there's very few methods that you could use that actually work to control what goes on there. So you kind of have to make these blanket things, like where you actually just shut down places to disperse camping altogether, or you open them up. You can't try to make sure that people are only there for 2 weeks, or that only people who need to be there, or they're only doing certain things. So I think it's really difficult. And so, yeah, I don't, it's a tough one. It'd be great. It'd be great if we had the resources to be able to kind of have that kind of policing in some ways. On the other hand, then that takes away some of the freedom of what public lands are, kind of what a lot of people think of them as. So,
yeah. Sarah, any thoughts about equitable solutions?
Oof, yeah, that's a tough one. I think shutting down public lands, increasing fees, I do think that has some serious repercussions for more equitable access. So those would have to be implemented very carefully, and because I do think that would, harm communities who have traditionally felt they can't access public lands and can't afford it. And I think maybe there's some different solutions that could be implemented in more heavily trafficked areas close to cities versus more rural areas that are seeing a big crush. Maybe there's a way to sort of, have some some sites that are just, they're going to be used a lot, and maybe we just need to accept that. And, acknowledging that there are still tons of places, maybe farther from urban areas, that are still relatively untrammeled and that are going to be harder to access. And if you really want that solitude and that like untrammeled experience, you go there if you can. But meanwhile, we save those places closer to cities for people who, don't have the means to go way out to find the most, remote, secluded, wildernessy spot.
Right. Yeah. I'm gonna sort of end with an idea, a thought from M. Dragowski, who's joining us, which I think is just a really interesting and provocative notion. M says, "Are we facing an opportunity to create new persistent communities from the public lands? There's a lot of talk about public housing. Could public towns be possible in America? Perhaps the BLM or another agency." And then M's question disappeared. But this notion of public lands being used really as a place for more permanent public housing and public communities is a really interesting one to me. So thank you, M, for that. And thank you to everybody. Thanks to Sarah and to Jonathan. Once again, you all have been joining High Country News for a conversation about the crush of new use and increased use on our public lands and how we can accommodate and manage that. Fascinating conversation. Obviously, this is an issue with a lot of really complex roots in social media, in increased housing costs, in the migration of urbanites to mountain communities. A lot to chew on here, for sure. So really appreciate the insights that you've brought to this, Sarah and Jonathan. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was great.
Thanks.
And we'll do this again. Once again, to folks who joined, this is the first of what we hope will be a regular series of conversations with High Country News readers and donors, giving you a look behind the scenes at HCN. You all really are the the heart and soul of this nonprofit organization. We so appreciate you reading the magazine and the website, supporting our work, and joining us for conversations like this. We've hung on to all the questions that people submitted in the chat room. We'll do our best to respond to those over time. Really great being here with you all this morning, and hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Take care.